Hi guys, my name's Andrew. I'm the club treasurer, but tonight I'm going to be giving the introduction to British parliamentary debating session. Just as a bit of a straw poll, are most people in the room familiar with 3-on-3 debating, like you would have done in first semester or like you would have done it at school? Just stick your hand up if you're familiar with that. Cool. So most of this session will go kind of like you're familiar with that, but don't worry, if you've never done it before, you'll still be able to follow along. The basic ideas of all these different types of debating, and there are a couple of different ones around the world. We only do 2 in Australia. The core idea stays the same. You're still arguing over a topic. There's 2 different sides of the topic. One group of people will be agreeing. One group of people will be disagreeing. So don't get too stressed about changing it up. Before I get into it, friendly reminder, sign up to the Pro-Am, which starts next week. It's the best way to learn about how to do BP. You'll be paired with someone who's a bit more experienced than you, hopefully, if we've got enough people, and they'll teach you how it goes. And then the tournament after that is called Free Hills. All right. At the end of the session, you should be hopefully have answers to all of these questions. At any stage, if something doesn't make sense, stick your hand up and ask me, like, this isn't a lecture. You should feel very comfortable to interrupt me. I'm not an academic. And if at the end of the session you can't answer any of these questions, then remind me, because I might have skipped something. Okay, let's get into it. Why? Why do we do this weird, different format? And basically the answer is simple. It's because the World Debating Championships are in this format. We don't really have much of a choice. The World Championships, or World University Debating Championships, used to change every year depending on what country it was hosted in. But that didn't make much sense because you'd be doing a whole different style of debating every year. And so they chose BP. It's no better or worse than any other style, it's just different. It's why we do it. Alright, so let's explain what's new. The first thing and the weirdest thing is instead of 2 teams, an affirmative team and a negative team, there are 4 teams. 2 teams arguing for a motion, 2 teams arguing against the motion. It'll make a bit more sense later. But there are 4 different teams and each of them are trying to win independently. There are also points of information. It's a fancy title for the ability to stand up and interrupt a speech. While the opposition is speaking, you can stand up and try and offer a comment, a question, a query, a piece of rebuttal, or an argument in 15 seconds, and they're going to have to respond to it. So that's a pretty big difference. There's a slightly different way of winning a debate. Instead of just winning by proving your side's right, you've also got to win by proving your side is the most right, because there's going to be 2 people arguing it. If you think about it, with 4 teams, 2 teams on each side, you're also competing against someone who agrees with you. The other team that agrees with you is not going to be rebutting you, and you're not going to rebut them, but you've still got to beat them by doing a better job. The 4th point, jargon. The whole thing, as indicated by the title, is a mock parliament. We're all pretending that we're sitting in the British Parliamentary House with our wigs on, elected by the representatives, or in the House of Lords because you were born that way. And so you use slightly different language. You refer to the room as a house. You refer to the adjudicator as Mr. or Madam Speaker. Instead of first affirmative speaker, you've got the Prime Minister, things like that. Prep time, you only get 15 minutes. Speaking time, it's only 7 minutes. At the end of the day, it's still a debate though. So why 4 teams? Because this is the biggest difference. It's obvious at the start. It's because it's based on a Westminster Parliament where you've got a coalition government and a coalition opposition. In the same way that the Liberal Party and the National Party form a coalition and they both agree and they both vote together, but they're also out there for different things because the National Party is more interested in country people and the Liberal Party is more interested in screwing over boat people and stuff. They do these in a different way. They're consistent, but they're trying to do a better job. Alright, this is what it looks like. From a bird's eye view of how a debate's going to go down, you'll have someone speaking up the front, you'll have the opening government there, closing government behind them, opening opposition opposite them, closing opposition behind them, and then somewhere in the back there'll be an adjudicator. This is just so you've got an idea of how it works. 8 different speakers, 2 from each team. They've each got a different title. These titles will become obvious later on. I've used acronyms after each one, OG, OO. They're very widely used. They'll become obvious later. Opening government, opening opposition, closing government, closing opposition. Those are the names of the positions. You'll see that they're kind of in reverse. You've got government members and opposition members. There we go. and whips on each side. So does that all make sense? Odd titles, odd names, but it's all doable. There's nothing too crazy thus far, I hope. Alright, so what do you try and do in these debates, and how is that different from normal debating? You're trying to win, obviously, but you do it in a slightly different way, and everyone's got a slightly different role. The opening half, opening government and opening opposition, is pretty similar to 3-on-3. You're still going to stand up and provide the context for the topic in the debate. You're probably going to define the topic. You'll provide a model if you need to provide a model. You'll split your arguments up between your first speaker and your second speaker. The opening opposition, or like a first negative speaker, will talk about the clash in the debate. Everyone will have arguments. Everyone will have rebuttal. So that all should be pretty familiar. For the opening half, it's just like a normal debate. Prime Minister stands up, they give a first affirmative speech. Opposition leader stands up, they give a first negative speech. It's just got different titles. It's the same idea though. There's nothing too crazy in the first 4 speeches. Everyone in the debate, including the final 4, has to stay active and involved the entire time. If you think about it, and if we go back to this one, the opening government team is the first and third speech in the debate. And so after that, they never get another chance to speak in the debate. That's 5 speeches of 7 minutes each. At the very shortest, that's 35 minutes until the debate's over, and they won't have a chance to speak again. And so the way they stay active is by what I talked about earlier, called points of information. They get the chance to interject in the speeches that are happening after theirs to stay relevant in the debate. Because to win, you've got to be relevant at the end of the debate. If you're not relevant, you're not going to win. Alright, what are the closing teams? This is where British parliamentary gets a little bit confusing, and this is like something that people, after an intro session or after doing lots of BP, may still struggle to grapple with. The purpose of the closing teams in a debate and what they're trying to achieve is subtly different. They can't disagree with the teams that came before them, and so the government member and the government whip still have to agree with the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, and so if they do disagree, that's referred to as knifing. Obviously, that's a bad thing. You're unlikely to win a debate if you egregiously knife the team in front of you, because it's seen as unsportsmanly. But what they do have to do is extend the debate. They have to, in some way, somehow, make the debate different. So what's been going on in the first half is all well and good. They don't think it's wrong. They don't think it's they don't think any of it's incorrect. But they have to say that the opening government took the wrong stance on this debate, or took the less important stance on this debate, and we think the more important stuff is here. And so, for an example, because that seems kind of theoretical, if the opening government spent a lot of time talking about the economic impacts of the policy at hand, how this is going to cripple Australian society because if you got rid of the minimum wage, everyone would be stuffed or something like that, or like everyone would be better, for example, the closing government could stand up and say, yeah, that's true, it would do that stuff to the economy, blah. What we think is more important, though, are the social issues, and that's what we're going to spend the next 2 speeches talking about, because the way it impacts people and the way they live their life is more important. And so they're going to try and twist the debate away from where it was before. Does that make a little bit of sense? Does anyone have any questions at this stage? At any stage, if you've got questions, feel free to stick your hand up and ask them. So they'll be trying to extend the debate, and this is often packaged as an extension, like somewhat clearly. They're still going to be doing rebuttal though, they're still going to be clashing with the opposition sides. They've just got to try and do it in a different way. You can't win a debate from closing if you just copy what your opening said, because they're going to get the credit for the material because they're the team that said it first. What closing teams have to do is take advantage of the extra time they've got. The thing with British parliamentary style is you only get 15 minutes to prep. And so literally the Prime Minister has had 15 minutes to speak before they stand up and deliver a 7-minute speech. They don't have a lot of time to think. They're probably just going to be saying the first shit that comes into their mind. The closing teams have to take advantage of that and come up with better versions of that material or different material to come out with later. Alright. To make that like a little bit easier, I've stepped through each of the different speeches and what they do. These are the first 4 speeches in the debate, the opening half. So that's opening government, opening opposition. Pretty standard. The Prime Minister will stand up and give the context of the debate. Where do they think this model takes place? Why do they think it's being debated? Is there anything topical that's happened recently that makes this important? They're going to define it. They're going to give a model. If and once necessary, they'll give arguments. Opposition leader, just like always, will explain where they disagree, i.e. the clash. They'll provide a counter model if necessary, rebuttal, team split, and arguments. Same with Deputy Prime Minister and Deputy Opposition Leader. Hopefully that's reasonably clear. After that though, that's going to get slightly more interesting because the members, like I talked about, when the closing government has to and the closing opposition have to extend, that means the government member and the opposition member will have to in some way provide an extension. They'll still have rebuttal and they'll still have arguments, but that rebuttal and the arguments especially have to be with a new way of viewing the debate. They're going to have to be twisting it somewhat in some way. The government whip, and I've just found another typo. The government whip is just like a third speaker. They'll rebut, but they should be aware that when they're rebutting, that this the focus of their rebuttal should be on their extension, because they've got to make it seem like they were the most important two speeches in the debate. Not only to beat the other sides, but also to beat their opening half. Same with the opposition whip. Any questions about that? Yeah. No. So if you're answering it a different way, it's not knifing. But I think there was like another good question there, and that's the closing teams have to respond to both opposition teams. And so you don't just focus on the team directly across the debate from you. You've got to focus on the entire opposition bench, if that makes sense. The closing government doesn't just rebut closing opposition and vice versa. They've got to also rebut opening opposition. Was that clear? There's a lot of stuff you've got to do in each of the speeches, but that's what makes it difficult. I don't know, deal with it. Alright. So, extensions are often the hardest bit of British parliamentary because aside from points of information, which I'll get onto last, there's not much that's really that different. The opening half is just like a normal debate. Extensions, though, different. How do you do it? How do you come up with something new or whatever? Like, how do you win the debate from closing teams? Because as you get better at British parliamentary and you get more familiar, you see quite often closing teams do win. I think, like, statistically, slightly more often than opening teams, just because it's a really big advantage to have that extra time to think about stuff. Your extension has to be new, distinct, or it can be particular. And above all, though, it's got to be important. When I say, like, distinct or particular, that means you don't have to entirely move the debate away from what was talked about. The example I gave earlier of how, like, if the opening focused on economic impacts and then the closing wanted to speak about social impacts, that's fine. But also, you can just do a better job than your opening of discussing the same things. You can talk about the same issues, but if you do it with better analysis or better examples or just better rhetoric and you stand up there and you sound more charming and you are more convincing, then that's fine. You've just got to do it in a different way, and that's important, that you can also distinguish it. So you can do that by providing like deeper, more in-depth analysis, different analysis, repackaging stuff, any way at all. Alright, and so there's an example of one here, and this was in the Melbourne Mini Grand Final at the end of last year. Melbourne Mini is a world's warm-up tournament held by Melbourne Uni. It goes over a weekend, like Friday, Saturday, Sunday, at the end of every year, and it's like reasonably high quality, like quite high quality. Most of the teams in the grand final will also make the finals of Worlds. Anyway, and the topic of the grand final was something along the lines of that feminists should not criticise female performers or pop stars who use their sexuality to get ahead, or something along those lines. So basically, it immediately became the Miley Cyrus debate, because just before that tournament, the context was that Miley Cyrus had done that dance with Robin Thicke, with the big hand and all that jazz going on. And so that was the example that everyone was using of a female performer using her sexuality to sell records, to make money, to earn publicity and all that. So the debate was pretty standard. The opening government stood up and was like, feminists shouldn't criticise this because this is great, it's empowering for her, she's doing all this stuff. Opening opposition stood up and were like, are you kidding me? This is really sexist, she was degrading herself, blah, 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 blah. Pretty standard, I'm sure you can all imagine how that would have gone down, how there were two different sides of that, of that idea. What the closing opposition did to extend, and why it's a particularly good extension that ended up seeing them winning the debate, was they stood up and were like, everything our opening said was true. We do think that Miley Cyrus was being degraded by this performance. We do think that she wasn't owning it, wasn't empowering, rather she was just selling out. But we don't care, and this is where they extended. They said, we don't care whether it was good or was bad. What we care about is that feminists remain relevant by having a discussion in the open. We think that having this discussion in and of itself is a good one, because otherwise, if feminists don't criticize people like Miley Cyrus, then they're going to be they're going to be stuck in the backwaters of society. They're not remaining relevant. They're not doing anything. It's important that feminism has this discussion out in the open so it stays relevant. And you see how that twists the debate. Because at the start, it was about whether what Miley Cyrus did was good or whether it was bad. What closing opposition did was they were like, no, we don't care whether it was good or bad. We just want feminists to have this discussion. We want them to criticize Miley Cyrus just so this discussion happens. In and of itself, they thought the discussion was a good thing, no matter the outcome. Do you see the distinction there? Does that all make sense to people? That's quite a sophisticated extension, because it completely twisted the debate, right? It was no longer on the grounds that the opening teams assumed it was, and if you can do that well enough, you win the debate. Obviously, I wouldn't expect people, and I wouldn't expect good teams to come up with those extensions all the time. Like that team that won that tournament also made the grand final of Worlds that year. We think they were the runner-up. You don't actually get told who was the runner-up. But yeah, so they're a fantastic team. But that's the kind of extension, and that's what we're after. Yeah. No. So it's up to the adjudicator's discretion, and they're going to make a judgment about it. But basically, you still have to be talking about the topic at hand, and so you can't twist it so much that it's unrecognizable, or you can't are you guys familiar with squirreling a debate? You can't change the definition so that it is unfair or unworkable or truistic or anything like that. So you can't twist it too much, basically, is the answer to that question. But how much is a bit of there's a spectrum of appropriateness. It's a bit of a grey area. Any questions on this, on extensions in general? They are the most challenging part of British parliamentary. They're not that much fun until you get the hang of them, but they are also an opportunity to have really niche areas of analysis suddenly become exciting. You get to talk about different topics that you wouldn't have otherwise, because there's suddenly a team that's standing up and trying to make existentialism the most important part of a debate when it really isn't. Sometimes they'll succeed, or sometimes they won't. All right, so we're going to move on from extensions now, unless anyone has any more questions. Cool. This is a simple question. What do you do in the 15 minutes of prep time? Opening, just prep like normal. They should try and come up with all the best arguments they can think of and then present them as well as possible. What they should consider during that time is they're going to have a closing that's coming out after them, and they also want to beat the closing, obviously, because you want to win the debate. And so they should consider doing something that's called matter grabbing, and that's when you talk about as much stuff as possible. You canvass all the possible things in the debate, everything you could possibly brainstorm, and what that means is that the closing can't have an extension. You've essentially blocked them out of the debate by just talking about so much that they're screwed. If you can do that successfully in a 15-minute prep time and then 2 7-minute speeches, you're a genius. And so it's quite difficult, right? But it's something to attempt. Closing teams obviously can't prepare an entire case, because if they prepare their extension and they're like, we want to extend in this direction, and then get into the debate and find out that that's exactly what the opening team's going to talk about for 2 speeches, then they can't use it anymore, because it's not new, it's not unique, it's nothing special. They can't say it's more important because it's not their contribution. So what they should do is make a list of different ideas, flesh out a couple of them, kind of be ready to be flexible, basically, be ready to go on any of them, and then as it gets into the debate, cross off the ones that get talked about and decide sometime during the opening half which one they're going to pursue more fully. That means it's slightly more difficult because they've got to write their speeches immediately before going up, but that's part of debating. Any questions on that? Not really. If you spend 30 seconds on something that they spend 4.5 minutes on, unless they're repeating them for 4.5 minutes, but if they genuinely provide new stuff and it's just on the same issue, then they're still going to get credit for it. But like as much as possible, you can then kind of try and claim that back as your own. It's always going to be better for an opening team if they've at least mentioned something that the closing then goes to extend on, because then it seems like they had the idea first. Even if they don't fully explore it and the closing team does that a bit more, it's still better for an opening team to have mentioned it. And sorry, I just realised this might not have been clear. Maybe I should have said this earlier. But the way the decision works in British parliamentary is that the teams are ranked 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so you can have the opening government winning, coming first, and then the closing opposition coming second, and then any different mix of 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't win as a bench. The government doesn't win together and the opposition doesn't win together. It's each team wins individually as a unit. And so the adjudicator will decide that opening government was the most persuasive, but then maybe closing opposition was the second most persuasive, then opening opposition, and then finally closing government came fourth, even though their opening came first. Does that make sense? The way it works, the way it gets divided up. You are not a team with the other team that's on your side. They're not your friends, they're your enemies. 7-minute speeches, 1 knock at 1 minute, 1 knock at 6 minutes, 2 knocks at 7 minutes, or claps or bells or whatever the adjudicator sees fit. The purpose of the knocks at 1 and 6 minutes is to talk about protected minutes. You can't be offered a POI or like an interjection in the first minute of your speech or the last minute of your speech. There's only a 5-minute period where you can get offered them between the first and the second minute, the first and the 6th minute rather, and that's indicated by the knocks. Alright, we're on to POIs now. And I'm going super quickly. I'm going to be finished soon. Does anyone have any questions before we move on? Any at all? Alright. POIs. You can only offer POIs to the opposition. Even though I said they're not your friends, you can't offer them to the same people who are on your half. You can't offer them, if you're the opening government, you can't offer them to the closing government. You can only offer them between the first and last minutes, as I said. The thing to remember is that the person who is speaking has the ability to reject points of information. They will get them offered to them and they'll wave them down or say no thank you or tell you to sit down or anything like that because they only need to accept a couple. To offer them, you need to stand up from your seat. So it's a bit annoying in lecture theatres like this where you've got a desk across your knees, but you can just deal with that. And you stand up and say something along the lines of point, madam, sir, point of information, on that point, sir, madam, whatever. Any of those things basically. You might see some like wankers stand up and put their hand on their head and stick out their hand like this. That's buying further into the idea that this is a House of Parliament, because in the British Parliament, I don't know if they still do, but they definitely used to wear wigs, like lawyers. And so when someone stood up, they literally had to put their hand on their head, otherwise the wig would have fallen off. And so some people like to buy into that and stick their hand on their head. Not many people do that these days, but like feel free if that's what you're interested in. There are ill-mannered people who say stuff other than point, madam, sir, or anything like that. You probably shouldn't. Some people will stand up and say, like, on the economy, or on feminism, or on facts as opposed to lies, or something like that, when they're trying to offer a POI. That's rude. You should just say point or sir, because otherwise they don't get the proper chance to reject you. When you're offering them, and we'll talk about what goes into them in a second, but when you're offering them, you should offer a lot. You'll be rejected for most of them. You won't have a POI accepted very often, but you should offer a lot, because it seems like you're engaged, it seems like you're winning the debate, it seems like you always want to interrupt them because you know better than them. It's a big confidence thing. You should offer 5 a speech. That is 1 a minute. Be aware, like when you're doing a practice debate, as I hope most of you do after this session or after the pizza break, look at the time. 1 a minute is a lot. You'll feel weird doing it. I guarantee most people won't offer that many, but you should try. Offer a lot. It's how this style of debating works best. Alright, what do you say? So, if you are accepted, be aware most of the time you won't be accepted. You've got 15 seconds of like pure, unadulterated silence to say whatever you want. You should write what you want to say down, because people think that they can just make these up on the spur of the moment and then stand up and say something like, so don't you think this harms people more than it helps people? Literally, you hear POIs like that, like, I don't know, that doesn't mean anything, right? That's the entire debate in one question. It's a bit of a waste of time. So what you do want to say, though, is basically whatever would make you look good. You can include a little bit of rebuttal in 15 seconds. You can provide a counter example in 15 seconds. You'd be like, what about this? Like, did you consider this when you were talking about that model? You can use the opportunity to clarify. You can use the opportunity, if you're an opening team, to bring back your material. Say in a debate where the closing teams have extended the debate away from where you were talking about, and you seem irrelevant because of that, you can stand up and offer a POI that's directly related to your material to try and bring it back. Ideally, phrase it as a question. An easy way to do that is to say a statement and then add, do you agree at the end? Like, ideally it should be a question, but I suppose it doesn't have to be. Alright, now let's flip to the other side, away from offering onto accepting. When you are the speaker, people will be standing up and hopefully bombarding you with requests to interrupt and interject and speak. You should reject most of them. Only accept 2 POIs during your speech. Only accept 2 POIs during your speech. It's very tempting when you don't have much material to just think, oh, this is a great opportunity for me to come up with more stuff, or for me to, like, you know, fluff the speech out so it makes 7 minutes. It's better to sit down earlier than to accept more than 2 POIs. So the way you reject them, because you'll be offered more than 2, is either by waving them down, by saying no thank you, by saying not now. Like, if they're getting annoying and offering too many, if they're standing up every 10 seconds, you can say sit down. Don't be rude, but anything like that is appropriate. You should try and accept 1 from each team on the opposition side, so from the opening and the closing. If you want to, you can leave them hanging. And so it's important with POIs to accept them when you want to. You are always in control when you're speaking. You can only be interrupted when you want to be interrupted. And so don't take them in the middle of a sentence, because that's just going to make you look bad. Don't take them in the middle of an argument. Don't take them in the midst of your rebuttal. Take them at the natural pauses in your speech. At the end of an argument, when you're transitioning from one to the other, or anything like that. So if you want to, if someone stands up and it's not an opportune moment to take it, you can say, and I'll take you in a moment, and then continue talking, finish the argument, and then go, okay, shoot. Give them the chance later on. You're at complete liberty to do anything like that. Any questions on that? If you're interested, or like if no one is offering POIs, you can request them. You can stand up and be like, and I'll take a POI now if anyone would like to offer one. It's a little bit rude because it kind of implies they're doing a shit job, but also if they're not offering POIs, feel free to do it because they are doing a shit job. You should try and answer the question as quickly as possible. Be aware, the POI is literally just distracting you from the essence of your speech and what you were trying to convince the adjudicator of. And so answer it quickly. Don't waste too much time on it, but do it well so you seem super persuasive. The reason why you accept them is because you have to, basically. The adjudicators will frown upon a team that does not accept enough POIs, and so you should accept 2 in each speech. You can get away with only accepting 1 if your partner accepts 2, that's fine, but you should try and accept 2. It's a good opportunity to make you look really good. If someone offers a dumb POI, you can tell them you're dumb, and you'll seem more persuasive because of that, because you seem like you're in control of stuff. Alright, what goes into a good POI? So, 15 seconds, so it should be short, sharp, and direct. Ideally, you'd point out huge mistakes or contradictions, but you can use rebuttal, you can clarify stuff, or anything like that. Basically, a POI is good if it makes the speaker look bad, or if it makes your material later on look better. Sorry. An example of a good one. This was in a Worlds final a couple of years ago. The topic was on something along the lines of that we should allow any kind of advertising in print media and on the news use. And so they were like any kind of indecent advertising, basically. And so it meant people could use, there was no restrictions on what was appropriate at certain times of the day to put on TV. And so you could have like, you know, sex selling things at any time of the day. Basically, that was the debate, right? That people should be allowed to have any kind of ads used at any time. And the teams were arguing about whether they thought this was appropriate, and one of the teams stood up and had this really hard line: we think freedom of expression is really important, we think people can be exposed to anything they want to be exposed to. It doesn't really matter if you think you're going to be offended by like seeing boobs on TV at 3 p.m, that's fine, you're just going to have to deal with it. And so the other team stood up and offered them a POI and were like, would you allow people to have sex in public? Because that's kind of like a natural extension, right? But also, it's just like, seems crazy. And so the reason why this was successful is because, like, A, it made the audience laugh, which made the speaker look dumb, but also the speaker was just kind of dumbfounded, and it was just like, instinctively, no, you don't want to allow people to have sex in public, but also, how was that principally consistent with what he was arguing to do with the ads? Like, you're kind of stuck. And so the speaker ended up like and ahhing for a little while, and then was just like, if you can prove that it's principally consistent, then sure. And so it just looks bad, makes the other team look more persuasive. That's all you're going for. Obviously, you're not always going to be able to come up with gems like that, but just try and be a little bit witty, try and point out their mistakes or anything like that, just like you normally do rebuttal, only it's in 15 seconds and it's during their speech. Tactics. So I've already talked about matter grabbing. That's something that opening teams will do to try and shut out their closing teams. Closing teams can, and this is like an optional kind of tactic appropriate in different scenarios, try and flag their extension with points of information. So at a certain stage, the closing teams will know what they want to do in their speeches. They will know how they want to extend. And so they may take the opportunity to offer a point of information that flags that early. If they're going to move on, like the example I gave earlier, to talk about social issues, they might decide to give a POI to the opposition team about social issues earlier on in the debate so that the adjudicator can see what's coming, basically, so they can get involved in debate earlier than they would have otherwise. This is kind of user beware, though, because if they do it too early, then a smart opening team can be like, oh, cool, they're going to talk about social issues. I'm just going to write that into my speech right now, and they'll steal the material. Do you see how that might work? So you've got to use it at an appropriate time, kind of late in the speech. It's not really worth explaining shutting out and staying in. You'll learn those kind of things later. It's not really that important. Alright, any questions? Okay. So, yeah, sorry. No, so there's no definite amount. Like, don't offer one every 10 seconds. It's called badgering if you offer them too much. Like, it's just rude. So, just you'll get a feel for it pretty soon, what's appropriate and what's too much. It's normal that by the time you get to the end of the debate, like the opposition whip, the last speaker in the debate, they get offered a shitload of POIs because everyone's finished speaking and they just want another chance to speak. And so they'll spend more of their time waving down other people than anyone else in the debate. Alright, on this slide, outlined the kind of difference between the four teams. Because more so than in regular debating, and this is another difference between BP and normal 3-on-3, each of the different teams is a little bit unique. Opening government doesn't get a very good chance to respond because they've only got they've got the first and third speech in the debate. What they need to do in response then is try and cover as many bases as possible and then stay relevant with POIs. Opening opposition, like nothing too crazy here. They're the first people to get a shot to respond to the opening government because they've got to make sure they've got a substantive case as well, stay relevant with POIs as well. Closing government needs to extend, but critically, and if you think about this, the government whip, the fourth speaker on the government side, the seventh speaker in the debate, is the only one who has the opportunity to rebut closing opposition. Because the closing opposition has the last speech in the debate, and they've got the third last speech. And so, if the government whip doesn't rebut closing opposition's extension, then literally no one will, because no one has the opportunity. It's just something to think about. It's a bit of a unique thing in that position. Closing opposition, like I said, they've got the third last and the last speech in the debate. So not many people get the chance to respond to them, but at the same time, they get involved super late. And so it's easy for them to just not be relevant because they haven't had the time to develop their material, or to like run out of stuff to say, basically, because they're right at the end. Any questions on that? All right. Oh, we're not that early, like 8 minutes early. This is the end. I expect this was a little bit confusing. That's the nature of BP. It is a different beast. Don't worry though, it definitely becomes easier once you see more debates. You'll have the opportunity after the pizza break to either do a debate yourself if you want to jump into the deep end, and that's fine. That's a really good way to learn. Or I think there will be an opportunity to watch a debate. I'm not sure where that debate's going to be held, but there'll be announcements later. So you can either watch a debate between people who've done BP before, or you can take the opportunity to do a practice debate yourself. Both are fine. Both are good ways to learn how it's going on. No, not really. It's kind of like a third next speech. Yep. And they should definitely try hard to do lots of those. It's just like regular debating. It just looks bad. And eventually, like at about 7 minutes 15 or 7:20, the adjudicator's just going to start clapping. And so, after 7 minutes, the adjudicator's just going to stop listening too. So you don't get credit for anything said after 7 minutes. There's no really any penalties for going short. So don't stress if you go short. It's not worth taking extra POIs. Just take 2 and sit down. It shows a certain level of maturity. I've always thought to be able to sit down early. And just recognize that you finish rather than rambling on. Just general. Like I think in an ideal world they would be officially timed, but no one does. Don't offer POIs that go for too long. Also, and I forgot to mention this, when you're accepting a POI and someone's talking, if you understand where they're going and they're just rambling or repeating themselves, you can tell them, okay, I understand, sit down. And then you can respond to it, or anything along those lines, or yeah, okay, I'm with you, or like cut to the chase. It's kind of like a dialogue, although don't have a conversation. Any more questions? Cool. Well, that's the end of this session. Pizza will arrive in about 5 or 10 minutes. Feel free to do whatever you want. If you've got any more questions, come and ask me. Thank you.